Okay, welcome everyone to the February 1st OMR Architecture Meeting. Today I would like to bring up, I'd like to have a discussion on OMR releases. It's been a number of years since we've, well, OMR's been around for, this is going to be its 8th year, and we've haven't really had a release discussion in the past 5 years. So, but there's a number of reasons why we probably want to restart this process this year. So just to take you back a bit to October 4th, 2019. So this was the first and only release of Eclipse OMR to date. And even getting to that date took a bit of planning. We've been talking about this since 2018. At that time, the OMR was less mature than it is now. We decided at that point that the components that we have, we could achieve API stability on port, thread, and the util components, and we could ascertain or certify that the other components were functionally stable. And at that time, we produced a source archive for the release, and then we also built JIT builder binaries for x86 Linux and Mac OS, and had the whole thing hosted on GitHub. And that was really supposed to be the beginning of a 3-month cadence of minor releases. And the idea there was that we would have downstream projects that would be consuming milestone builds and testing them out. And there was a bit of discussion at that time around major releases and what the goals were, but we decided then that we're just going to start off with minor releases, and we'll figure out what we do as we go along. So that was the plan back then. But it didn't really quite work out that way. There were a few reasons why the regular cadence didn't get started, and I don't necessarily want to go into all those right now because they're not necessarily relevant for this restarting discussion. But for one of the things that was happening back then was that we really only had one production adopter of OMR, and that was Eclipse OpenJ9. And the way that Eclipse OpenJ9 worked at that time, and I think the way that they still work to this date, was to essentially consume the head of the OMR master branch rather than relying on regular stable releases and consuming those. And that works out for that project because they do perform a fairly thorough acceptance test prior to accepting the OMR, the head of the OMR master branch into their code base. So it's fairly well exercised from the OpenJ9's project point of view, and that's what works for them. But if we fast forward now to 2024, there actually are more than OpenJ9 isn't the only production adopter of OMR. There is community interest in consuming stable releases rather than heads, so following a more of a formal release process. And some of these adopters do prefer the formality of a release and the artifacts that come with it, rather than just a tagged commit somewhere that we point to. So they like the formality of source code, release notes, security information, change logs, that sort of thing. So what I'd like to do is to I'd like to propose that we restart the release process in OMR. And I would like to restart I don't really want to revisit all the decisions that were made back in 2018 for doing the releases and the way that we would structure the releases. I think that many of those points are still valid. It's just the execution of those is something that we need to follow through on. So I put a link to the issue that we were using originally to discuss this. And that is something that you can read and consult and look at some of the discussions that have happened there, and even the justification for some of the decisions that we made. The idea here is that we would maintain a trunk-based development workflow. So all the work that we're currently doing right now happens in the master branch. And when we are at points where we think that we want to do a release, we would create a new release branch. And that release branch is where we would allow the code to stabilize for that particular release. And it may be the case that we need to, in order to do that stabilization, it may be the case that some dual deliveries of fixes into that release branch and the master branch happen at the same time, but those are relatively, hopefully should be relatively minor. If you're familiar with the OpenJ9 development workflow, this is similar to how they do that sort of thing as well. The release cadence, I think, will be focused more on minor releases at this point. So the way that the Eclipse Foundation kind of defines their releases is somewhat skewed toward the semantic versioning format of releases, where you have major, minor, and milestone releases. I think this project is, I think OMR is in the category of doing minor releases for at least the foreseeable future. What I'd like to see is that we do the 3-month cadence that was discussed and agreed to earlier. But unlike the last time, I think the way that we, just to reduce the overhead a bit, I'd like to only do source code releases. And the source code will be hosted at the Eclipse OMR project at GitHub. In terms of the quality bar that must be met, I think that, well, the number of OMR-specific tests is somewhat limited. And I think that if you do a PR build at this point, a pull request test essentially is running all the tests that we have. So I don't think that the bar could be any higher or lower than that. So at this point, that is the quality bar. We have to ensure that those PR tests are all successful and all the platforms and OS combinations that the project has available to test on. In addition to those minor releases, the Eclipse Foundation also encourages, if not requires, language isn't quite clear, but they may require the use of milestone builds as well, which occur in between minor releases. And essentially what these are builds that downstream adopters can take and evaluate and provide feedback to the project on. And what we had agreed to before, and I think is still reasonable, is that we do monthly based or monthly milestone builds that are simply based again on the clean PR criteria. However, rather than actually hosting the source code somewhere, for these ones, I would propose just doing a commit tag in the source archive in the event that a downstream adopter does want to evaluate these. I guess if there is enough interest, we could go through the process of producing a source archive and having it stored somewhere. But at least initially, I'd like to propose just tagging a particular commit. And then major releases, I think ultimately a 1.0 release and even getting beyond incubator status for OMR is a long-term goal, but I don't think that we should necessarily be driven by that. I think we have a number of things that we need to work on in the project before we ever get there. And one of those things is essentially defining what exactly is the public API for the various components that we have. And I think that only a very small subset of the components that we do have those APIs. I expect that this whole process is going to be somewhat iterative in the sense that we're not going to get it right right away. I think we're going to figure out what works, and we're going to evolve and adapt to what works best for this project and the resources that we have to work and deliver releases. So before I go any further, I'm just going to stop there and let anybody that wants to interject, please jump in and ask questions or raise any concerns, comments. Okay.
Do you have a, sorry, I do have one question. Do you have a view for how, they don't happen all the time, but things like coordinated merges that are done between OpenJ9 and OMR, do you have a view for how those fit into this proposal?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think the development model for OMR is still just going to be one commit at a time, and they would just fit into a. So coordinated merges, I think, are more important from an OpenJ9 perspective, not an OMR perspective, mainly to prevent their acceptance builds from breaking. But I don't think it'll be much different here. I don't know if there will be some, even the complications around the release splitting. I'm just thinking here, you know, we would still deliver it into master branch, and that's where OpenJ9 would be picking it up. That's where the coordinated merge would happen. They wouldn't be picking up the release branch, so I think we'd be okay there.
I think you don't think it's complicated if OpenJ9 has a release that's based off of like a release branch based on release. Now you have two coordinated merges, which would be complicated.
More effort.
Other than that, I should be fine. The only point is why 3 months? Like, I mean, I don't know what a good cadence is. I'm just curious as to why 3 months.
Yeah, I think that it was at the time. I think part of the motivation from that was to line up with our biggest stakeholder, which was OpenJ9, biggest adopter, which is OpenJ9. So it is frequent enough. So the other thing is, as we start to get more downstream adopters, their schedules are not all in sync either. And I think 3 months gives us the right kind of granularity, so that they're not waiting 6 months for a release or a year for a release kind of thing. They will, in some cases, do more than one release a year. Those products may do more than one release a year, so they may need a finer granularity. I don't want to go any lower than 3 months. That's at this point, at least. I have no idea how much overhead this is going to be. This is my first time through this myself, so I could be. Well, it may change. Who knows? Maybe every 4 months. I don't know.
Like right now, the quality is more or less the same, but it's the idea that the milestone builds are not supposed to be anything that should take a production. Like a downstream project should not take a milestone build. It should just be
Eclipse doesn't even call them. They say you can't even call them releases. They want you to call them builds.
Right.
And yeah, the idea is they are not going to be the release. But I wouldn't expect that there's going to be, from an OMR perspective, there probably won't be any different. Like there's usually not recurring problems in OMR. And we can maybe talk about that in a bit, because there are recurring problems in OMR, but we've handled those in different ways. But
sounds like just a way to avoid the overhead of the release process. Not having to do that every month is like probably a good thing. We shouldn't jump from releases every 5 years to releases every month. Probably too much.
Yeah, I'm more worried about the human cost in this as well. I don't want to be a permanent release person on like this, doing this all the time.
So are the I know you've got a more specific proposal later on date-wise, but is the 3 months designed to line up with when OpenJ9 will be kind of shutting down their?
They're lined up for the yearly quarters.
Okay. Calendar quarters.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that was arbitrary. I just thought this year, let's do the first one at the end of March. The first quarter.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering. I don't have a strong opinion there, but it might be, like, if we could line that up with around the time that OpenJ9 is shutting down its quarterly release flow, then maybe it could become practical for OpenJ9 to also consume the release builds instead of taking from Headstream, and then, you know, notwithstanding the coordinated merge problem it creates, it would be like from an SBOM state or something like that, it might be a better story for OpenJ9. I don't know. Just a thought.
Yeah. We have to.
Peter's on the call. Peter, do you have an opinion about that? Do you care one way or the other? Maybe that was thing. Okay.
Yeah, I'm just going to give I mean, this is obviously an OpenJ9 question about how, if there are last-minute changes that need to be made to OMR, how that would get reflected in, like, over top of a release that OMR produces, right?
Right.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I think I had an extra mute on. So when OpenJ9 takes OMR, it does take the headstream, but it takes it, you know, a couple of months in advance, and then that branch is maintained with the fixes needed for the release. So
So you're already right. Okay. So then maybe it does.
For the next release, like for the April release, we're going to branch on February 16th. So if there was an OMR release ready in time, I suppose we can consider taking that. But what if the release is missing things that we need for OpenJ9? Do we then take the release and then add the things we need on top?
I mean, I guess yes. That's what you would. Isn't that what you're doing anyway, in a sense?
No, we take the headstream, so we know that anything we might need is there, and then if there's any problems found, we'll take those fixes. Or if somebody really wants to get something in and the risk is low enough, we might add a new feature.
Okay.
I'm not sure taking a release of OMR would be of any benefit. Just maybe make it more complicated.
Okay.
Even reporting what OMR is in OpenJ9, you now say, I'm taking this release plus these commits on top of that? Or would you just still give the SHA? I don't know.
Well, I think we'd probably still give the SHA and maybe also include the version number. That's what we do with OpenJDK, right? I mean, OpenJDK's got, this is the release of OpenJDK that it is, plus, in OpenJ9, that's what we do. Got this version of OpenJDK plus the stuff we need to ship OpenJ9. It's not very different in principle, but
right.
I'm not trying to create complexity for anyone. So
the difference might be in security problems. In the past, when there's been a security problem in OMR, OpenJ9 would create a CVE and just talk about OpenJ9, you know, how it's been a problem since some earlier version of OpenJ9. There would be no reference to OMR, even if the code with the security problem was in OMR.
Right.
So if OpenJ9 could refer to a version of OMR, then all of a sudden OMR CVEs might apply.
Right.
And people would then start caring which version of OMR is in there.
But that's a good thing if other consumers of OMR are around. Right? Like having the
every other consumer is going to want to know about security problems.
Right.
And which release they're fixed in.
All right. Move on.
Yeah, sure.
All right, so like the last time, I don't think much has changed in terms of the components that we want to include in the release. So I think we can still claim API stability on port, thread, and util. Probably a little asterisk there next to the port library, because I think some API changes have been made. but I think that if you read that issue that we had talked about, we were less concerned about API changes occurring between minor releases when the major version is 0.
Yeah, that's the semantic versioning.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the policy for semantic versioning, right?
Yeah, so there's a little bit more flexibility there.
Are those changes in the API, which I haven't been paying attention to, are those things that, like I said, did the API change or did we add?
We may have added, I don't know if they changed, you're right. Yeah.
That's another thing to look at. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Easier to add, obviously.
Right. And then the components where the bulk of the development happens, the GC compiler and JIT builder, at this point, we are just going to claim functional stability. They work against the tests that we have, and moving them to adopting a public API and a stable API is still a work in progress. 3 components that are on the list here that I'm not sure of are OMR Trace, OMR SIG Compat, and DDR. We had them in the release last time. I think there might be tests for them. I'd have to look into these. I don't know much about them and how they're consumed at this point, but we claimed functional stability last time for them. So how would a release work? So the Eclipse Foundation requires us to produce a release plan. This is a requirement for every release, and we have maybe a couple of ways that we could go about doing this. So one is to be, actually there's 3 ways we can go about doing this. One is to be proactive and try to describe all the content that we want to include in the release up front, which I think is not the way that we do things right now, not the way that development proceeds in OMR. The way development proceeds in OMR is things just happen to arrive in pull requests and that sort of thing. So we're not necessarily planning big features. Or we can be retroactive, right? At the end of when we're about to publish a release, we essentially say the plan is all the stuff that we did in the last few months, and that gets included in the content. So I think that what we could probably do is something in the middle, which is essentially put a very generic statement out when we create the release saying that we're planning on adding features for the compiler and garbage collector and that kind of thing. And then at the end of the release, we actually fill that information in with the actual things that were contributed over that time. I'm not sure if we need to use GitHub milestones to track things to make it easier to identify which PRs belong to which release, but we probably could do that. But one way or the other, we're going to need to put together a release plan. I don't know if anybody has any particular thoughts on that, which way we should go, proactive, retroactive. Let's pause there to see if there's any input.
Not like we're really planning content per se, right?
No.
It's almost kind of just picking whatever's the top commit that day, or
yeah. I was just going to go with whenever I proposed there, which is here's what we're generically what we're going to do, and here's what we did, kind of thing. Yeah.
One thing that's part of the release plans that I don't see listed here is platforms. Like, that's one of the other things we documented in the 0.1.0 release.
Yeah, I thought I said that somewhere, but maybe. Oh well, kind of. Oh, I thought I said it. Anyways, yeah, okay, you're right though. Yeah.
That's one. I mean, I think we have new platform, at least one new platform since we did 0.1.0. So
yep.
That would be one key new feature that we.
Yep. Okay. So for the milestone builds, I was just thinking we could tag a commit per month based on a clean PR test that happened to occur. Format seems to be following semantic versioning XYZ-M and then N being 1 to well, every month. So that's essentially it. When we get close to release time, let's create a GitHub branch. Name could be something I just borrowed what OpenJ9 does because it looks reasonable to me. VXYZ followed by a release to indicate that it's a release branch. One thing that we talked about last time we did a release was how to encode the version number in a build, and I don't know if we actually did that. There is in the OMR does have the notion of an OMR version string, which I think is actually used by OpenJ9, but I think that's injected by the build. Like, I don't know if there's actually a file that somebody can look at and see, oh, this is the version of OMR that I have checked, that I've cloned or whatever, that I've downloaded. So I don't know, we might need to create a file or something like that. If it doesn't already exist, maybe it does. I just haven't seen it. But if there isn't, maybe we should create a file when we create the release that contains the version of OMR.
I have a vague memory of creating a file in the binary that I did for JIT Builder, but that's not part of the release per se. Yeah, but I don't have a good memory of it. Could be mistaken.
Yeah. So, okay, I'll look into that OMR version string thing a bit more, but if we may just need to create some file that gets updated when we do the release. Yep, and then the release would be created and archived, the source of which would be archived on GitHub. So we would create in the Eclipse OMR project, we would create a new release and then hang the artifacts off of that. Any questions or comments on this? Okay.
Are you aware of the Eclipse progress review?
Yeah. So next, I think so. Yeah, so we have to do, Eclipse requires us to do a progress review or a release review you need to be in good standing for a year. So you need to be doing these reviews once a year. We have not done one for 5 years, 4.5 years. So I think we are a bit overdue. So I'm going to have to request one before we can do a release. And what a review essentially entails is to make sure that the project is operating within the approved scope. So essentially, the PMC is auditing what you're doing and making sure that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, and make sure that you follow the Eclipse Foundation development process. You're following the IP due diligence process. You've got documentation on various things, and the communication channels for the community are in place. And then they also provide this project checklist, which is essentially a very long list of aspirational things that you should try and do. But it's unclear of how many of those things actually need to be checked. I guess if none of them are checked, that's a problem. But if some of them are, maybe that's good. So I think we do check many of those boxes, but I think I need to make sure that we are up to date and current on a few things. Like, for example, our documentation has working links and information is more current about in terms of platforms and that kind of thing. So I'll need to get all that in shape before requesting a review. What I'd like to do is to target the end of March of this year for the 0.2 release, and I guess end of this month for the first milestone release toward that. So that gives us a couple of months to get some of these things in shape, and we can get the ball rolling on this. So that's the proposal. That's actually essentially the plan. I'm really following what we had already decided on 5 years ago, and finally committing to it. So discussion, any comments, questions, concerns?
to me.
All right. So I'll probably be reporting back on if there's any, well, just to give an update on how this is going, and when we've requested a review and that sort of thing. So you might see some activity on the Slack channel for some of these things. Peter, there's no, you're likely already aware, there's no in any of our listening consuming projects, there's no immediate impact to you. There's nothing you really have to do. It's any adopting project can decide to include a release or not, or you can do it the way that OpenJ9 currently does it right now. So I don't expect there'll be any churn associated with that.
I think OMR is a bit behind on its legal notices. So there's a legal notice generator that you'll probably find when you go through the progress review.
Okay.
I think not all the boxes are checked off for OMR. So I don't know if OpenJ9 will need to pick up a new file and include it in the builds once you add it in OMR.
Okay. All right, I'll look into that. Thanks, Pete. I'm sure that some of these stones we haven't turned over in, 5 years. So I think even the delta between releases you're supposed to document, which is an awful lot of commits. So that could be something.
I've got a script that'll go through all the changes and just give you a list of PRs.
Okay, maybe I can get that from you. Reach out to you, get that. Thanks. All right, any last minute comments on this? Okay, that was the only topic that I had for today. So thanks everyone for your time, and we will meet again in 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thanks.